in no way, shape, or form can it possibly really be said in real life that the UK is at the forefront of protecting Ukrainian refugees.
Hi, I'm Isabel Hogal, and this is Borderline. Today, we have an unexpected and unplanned episode, and I'm very grateful for my guest to be coming on at such quite short notice. So we're welcoming back Colin Yeo, immigration lawyer and founder of freemovement.org, to talk about the refugee situation out of Ukraine and what the UK and EU have been doing to support people fleeing the conflict or not doing. So thank you, and hello, Colin.
Hello, and thanks very much for having me on.
Very much appreciated. So I think we should start with quickly explaining the situation on the ground, though neither you nor I are there. And so we're mainly parsing news reports here. But what do we know of who has left or maybe leaving Ukraine in the days and the weeks to come?
This is something I don't feel terribly well qualified to speak about. Yeah, as you say, when I'm not on the ground, I'm safe here in the UK. I'm just reading the news the same as everybody else. I mean, what we're being told is that already, just a few days in, 500,000 people have fled. I think we've probably all seen with some horror the footage of women and children, especially leaving, men being kept back and told that they can't leave, being conscripted to fight. So there's clearly a sort of developing refugee situation, which is primarily affecting the countries immediately adjacent to Ukraine at the moment.
Hmm. And I guess it all depends on how long this lasts, right? Whether this is a few days and things kind of get quiet again, or if we're looking at weeks and months of fighting.
Yes, which is always the case with refugees. Again, I'm not an expert on the ground in what's going on. I'm not an expert in warfare either. It's very difficult to imagine this being a short conflict with things as they stand. Obviously, unexpected things, I guess, can happen, but at the moment, it does look like it's likely to be a protracted situation. Although I think, perhaps unlike some refugee situations, I think everybody hopes that Ukrainians who want to return home will be able to at some point in the medium term. It's not like some crises that we've had in the past, which have been, there's a permanent regime in place which is going to stay in place, and those who fled will never be able to go back. It's hopefully not going to be like that, but it's still very early days.
Yeah, yeah. And as we're speaking, I was just seeing there's a convoy 40 miles long of Russian military vehicles kind of snaking its way to Kiev. So unfortunately, I think we might be seeing some very terrible images in the coming days. But let's speak to what you are an expert on, which is the UK's response when it comes to immigration law and taking in people who might wish to find refuge here. So what has been the UK's response so far?
Well, I think that's an easy one to answer, and it won't take me long. 'Cause the answer is that almost nothing. The UK has done almost nothing, and that has to be seen in context. So, a Ukrainian to come to the UK currently requires a visa, and that hasn't changed. Whereas a Ukrainian traveling into the EU, at least into the Schengen area, doesn't require a visa, so they're able to sort of apply for entry and just enter at the border. They can't do that. They've got to apply for what we call a visa or an entry clearance before traveling to the UK. And they have to do that because otherwise an airline or a coach company or a ferry or whatever who carries them will be fined £2,000 per passenger. And it's this regime that academics call externalization, where basically the borders aren't just on the territory of the country concerned. They're kind of trying to export them to other countries to stop people from reaching, the territory of the United Kingdom or whatever other country. And the point of that is that once you actually reach the territory, once you're on UK soil, you can claim asylum. And so it's to stop people from claiming asylum once they reach the UK.
But we were hearing over the weekend from Boris Johnson that the UK was, quote, way out in front in terms of helping Ukrainians. Was that just not true?
I have to be quite careful using words here because I don't want to say
Yeah.
anything too difficult. But it's quite frankly, it's delusional to think that the UK is way out in front in protecting Ukrainian refugees. Obviously, Ukrainians are fleeing across the border in considerable numbers into adjacent countries like Poland and Moldova. those countries are at the front of protecting Ukrainian refugees. They've opened their borders. You've got private citizens, going to the border to try and pick people up and ferry them, offering shelter. You've got companies offering free transport to get them further into the interior to prevent a crisis developing at the border. Whereas the UK is carrying on requiring Ukrainians to apply for visas before they even sort of get on a plane or a coach or whatever to reach the UK. So in no way, shape, or form can it possibly really be said in real life that the UK is at the forefront of protecting Ukrainian refugees.
So what are the visas that they can apply for, provided they're able to jump through those hoops? Who are the Ukrainians who are welcome here?
Well, I said at the start that the UK has done almost nothing. So there is something that the UK has done. So they've made it slightly easier to get a visa if you are the family member of a British citizen. So if you are the immediate family member of a British citizen, which is quite closely defined. So it's if you're the spouse, or if you are the very dependent elderly relative, or sibling, perhaps, of a British citizen, or if you're the child of a British citizen. So that's quite a narrow group of people, and there aren't that many Ukrainians in the UK either. So we're not talking about a very large number of people. And basically, those people should find it easier to get a visa, and the normal rules, things like the minimum income rule and stuff like that, is being relaxed and waived by UK officials on the ground. So it's easier for those people to get a visa than it would have been, but they still have to apply for a visa before they can travel to the UK. So it's not the UK has done absolutely nothing; it's just almost absolutely nothing. They're kind of relaxed to the terms of some family visas. And one of the things that's been confusing for lawyers like me who've been trying to follow this is that the public announcements haven't actually been matched by Home Office policy. So, for example, Boris Johnson, I'm losing track of what's happened when at this point in time. It's all been so sort of unrelenting and tiring. But I think Boris Johnson yesterday said that the family members of Ukrainians who are settled in the UK, so haven't taken up British citizenship, that their family members will be able to reach the UK. But that's not the case, actually. The Home Office policy, as far as we can see, as stated on their website and as applied by officials on the ground, is still that it's only Ukrainian family members of British nationals, Ukrainians who've acquired British citizenship, or who were British in the first place, always were British and have got Ukrainian family for some reason.
Oh wow, I didn't know that. I was going by the announcement that Ukrainians, like non-citizens settled here, could sponsor people as well. So no, it's just citizens right now.
Yeah, I think your mistake there is taking Boris Johnson at face value, because it turns out that's just not the case. And Priti Patel said in Parliament that the elderly relative of somebody who wasn't she's somebody's mother, and a specific example was cited in Parliament by Yvette Cooper, who's the Shadow Home Secretary for Labour, and Priti Patel said, yes, that person would be able to enter. Well, she hasn't been able to enter. Home Office policy, as stated on their website, hasn't changed, that she can't enter. And the actual policy that's being implemented on the ground is that she can't enter. So you've got politicians, Priti Patel, Boris Johnson, saying things that, I can't really think of another way of putting this, but it's just not true. And maybe it will become true. Maybe the policy will be amended at some point. But certainly at the time that they've said these things, that has not been the policy of the British government, in fact, and it's not being implemented in that way on the ground. Although, that may change. Things are happening very quickly at the moment.
Mm. And we've seen this before. I mean, there were announcements regarding Afghanistan last summer that took months to become reality in practice and in law.
Well, they never have become reality. I know it's one of the things that makes me really quite cross about some of the things we're hearing now from the government, the UK government, about what's going to happen to Ukrainians. Priti Patel said 100,000 Ukrainians would be able to enter. She's modified that to up to 100,000. We're all familiar with advertising speak. The up to means that the number is worthless. There's no way 100,000 Ukrainians are eligible to enter under the rules that have so far been announced. And as you say, if we go back to the Afghan resettlement scheme that was announced by Priti Patel as being open last summer. Now, to be fair, there was a crisis going on. It was a really urgent emergency situation. But Priti Patel announced that this resettlement scheme was being launched, and it simply wasn't. It was actually launched in January 2022, several months later. And it turns out that it's not actually a resettlement scheme. It's really about trying to provide better support to the people who'd already been evacuated. So far, as far as I'm aware, no Afghans have been resettled under this resettlement scheme that was announced in the summer last year, which took the pressure off the government at the time. It's easy to make these announcements. People lose interest essentially, but it turns out that you sort of quietly then qualify it and then cancel it without anybody really noticing. So that so-called resettlement scheme is actually about the Afghans who were evacuated during the summer in those awful scenes we saw of people trying to get out of the country because of the Taliban advance. It's not about resettling any Afghan nationals who've already in Afghanistan or still in Afghanistan at the moment or have fled to surrounding countries. There's no way that those people can lawfully come to the UK. There's no queue for them to join. They're not going to get plucked out of a refugee camp by British officials. It's just not happening as far as I'm aware.
Mm. So one thing that baffles me, to be honest, is why be so strict and so set against welcoming Ukrainian refugees when you're seeing that there's actually quite overwhelming public support for them, and just being very very callous about it. As refugees go, white Christians from a country that's being attacked by an enemy of Britain, seems like the political cost would be quite small. So, are there other reasons for not wanting refugees to arrive in any number in the UK?
It's it's an impossible question to answer, I think, actually. I don't know what's going on inside their minds. I've got no particular insight into that. But what I think I can say is that the government's been very consistent, should we say, in being anti-refugee and being very reluctant to see refugees enter the UK, which contrasts with some commentators. We've seen some people who sound very welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, but not, they weren't welcoming to Syrian or to Afghan refugees. And the reason for that, one suspects, is straightforward racism when it comes down to it. It's because the Ukrainians are white and European. The government, to be fair, I suppose, in a way, is not doing that. They're being equally horrible to all refugees of all colours and origins. They just don't. I think they just don't like refugees. So the fact that there is public support out there isn't really the key issue. It's that they're not entirely about public support. They also have convictions, these people, and their convictions are that they don't like refugees. They don't want them in the UK, and so they're not letting them in, basically.
Mm. And I saw you write also about just the state of the asylum systems, and that there would be the queues, the administrative queues are extremely long, and then the accommodation even is hard to find.
Yeah, and the UK asylum system is in a really sorry state at the moment. And I think that's something that Patel kind of tries to use herself. She talks about the asylum system being broken, but what she doesn't say is that she broke it. The asylum system is in a really sorry state. The delays for existing asylum seekers have really increased over the last 3 or 4 years, basically almost trebled in the time that Priti Patel has been Home Secretary. Until she took over, things were actually okay. The most asylum seekers were getting a decision within 6 months. They'd then get a decision on appeal within about 6 months. The asylum accommodation was really unpleasant, and asylum support was very low, but people were going through that system relatively rapidly. But since she took over, the delays have massively increased. There's a huge backlog now. All of the normal asylum accommodation is full, so people are being accommodated in hotels. They're being put into these barracks, even during a pandemic. And the Afghan scheme has turned out to be a disaster. Nothing really happened for months and months to all those people who were evacuated. They're still in hotels, as I understand it. So, the British state has kind of made these promises to the public and to Afghans themselves, and then just totally failed to deliver on them. And maybe one of the reasons why officials and ministers are reluctant to make an offer to Ukrainians is because they're aware that they're in a sorry state already. But that said, it's it's not as if that's not holding back other nationalities, other governments. The Poles aren't saying, "Oh well, we've already got a lot of refugees, so we're not taking any more." The Moldovans are a tiny country, incredibly poor. They've opened their borders. They're doing what they can, and in contrast, the UK is doing almost nothing.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll get to Europe and the EU in a minute. Just one last question around the UK. We're in this context yesterday, just as the UK was essentially, refusing to take in Ukrainian refugees. The Nationality and Borders bill was being discussed in the House of Lords. Can you briefly tell us what that is about and how it plays in this whole context of this incredibly strict asylum and immigration policy?
I can try. There's quite a lot to the Nationality and Borders Bill, so I think I'll try and keep it as brief as I can. And there are parts of it I'm not going to talk about to do with nationality and so on as well. But the bits on asylum, there's lots of it there. But really, the theme of the changes that the government wants to make are that they want to penalise refugees who arrive in the UK via a safe third country. And that's been a kind of ongoing thing for them. They say that you're not a real refugee if you travel through a safe third country like France. And coincidentally, it turns out that therefore, because the UK is an island, that there's basically no real refugees. And that, before I say anything else, that contrasts with the actual asylum figures in the UK, where people think a lot of asylum seekers who claim asylum here, they're not really refugees, they're going to lose their cases and so on. Well, actually, 72% of asylum seekers who had decisions in 2021 were recognised as refugees or given protection on some other grounds. So that's from the Home Office. So the Home Office themselves, nearly 3/4 of refugees who received decisions in that year were actually recognised as refugees, and then more will win on appeal as well. So the percentage actually higher than that. So you've got officials on the ground applying the Refugee Convention quite properly. But you've got ministers saying, "Oh, well, they're not real refugees," even though actually we're giving them refugee status. So the idea of the Nationality and Borders Bill is that if you come through a safe third country, you'll be penalised in various different ways, or you'll be offshored, which is sent to some faraway country where they'll take over your asylum claim, basically, and accommodate you if you are granted asylum. And it's terrible timing from the government's point of view, I guess, because people can see that it's just a fundamental failure of solidarity to those refugees, but also to other countries like Poland and Moldova. If we say, "Okay, you're not a real refugee, so we're going to send you back. You should have stayed in Poland. You should have stayed in Moldova." And that's the whole philosophy of that legislation. And so, it's going through Parliament at the moment. The House of Lords voted on certain amendments just last night and rejected a lot of this stuff. What the government does in response, we're not sure, but they'll probably just try and force it through the Commons and force the Lords to agree to it at some later date. So I think we're still expecting that legislation to come into force, even though this crisis, I think, demonstrates to people that this idea of a safe third country is not a good one.
Mm. So by contrast, the EU has pretty much open borders. It took them a couple days, right? In the beginning, it um, looked as if the EU maybe wasn't going to be so generous. But what have they announced now? What's the legal situation for people fleeing into European neighboring countries?
So sadly, I don't follow European law as closely as I used to since we left the EU. But my understanding is that the borders have been open right from the start. Actually, Ukrainians could always be admitted for a period of 3 months into the Schengen area, and that's been going on. I think the EU is currently negotiating a sort of more comprehensive response. There's no urgent need for it because Ukrainians are entering for 3 months anyway under existing rules. But what the EU is looking at is allowing, I think, a 3-year period of residence to any Ukrainian simply because of their nationality, without them having to prove that they're a refugee as defined in international law or anything of that nature. There's talk about activating the Temporary Protection Directive, which was adopted quite early in the European asylum sort of system, back in the early 2000s, really in response to what had happened in the Balkans in the previous decade. And so that hasn't happened yet, but it looks like it's going to. And the EU is basically saying, look, if you're Ukrainian, we recognise that you can't go back to Ukraine and you can stay here and it'll be lawful stay.
Mm. With work permits and all of that.
As I understand it, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. That's quite more generous than reactions we've seen to the Syrian crisis or the Afghan crisis.
Yes, it is. It is, and I think, to be fair, some individual EU countries seem to respond quite well to the Syrian crisis. So Germany,
Yes.
the sort of famous line "We can cope" from Angela Merkel. Um, Other countries responded very, very harshly, and built border fences. Refugees died trying to cross those borders, and to enter via Greece and so on. Um, and it's certainly true that there is a real contrast with the way that Ukrainians are being welcomed by some of those countries who refuse to welcome Syrians and others.
Mm. And speaking of that contrast, which of course is connected to racism. Let's be honest. We've seen a lot of people, some of the people fleeing Ukraine. Obviously, it is a diverse country. It's actually home to more than 75,000 foreign students, international students, as well as refugees from other conflicts that had found refuge in Ukraine. And I was seeing also 35,000 stateless people, which is quite a big number. Um, so, what are protections and rights for them if they can't show a Ukrainian passport?
I don't know the answer to that, actually, and I
Mm,
imagine a lot of those people, if they are able to leave Ukraine, and we've seen scenes of some of them being refused boarding to trains and Ukrainian nationals being given preference, and those are really difficult choices that officials on the ground are facing, because they don't have unlimited evacuation capacity. They're having to make choices about who gets places and who doesn't, and they're giving preference to Ukrainian nationals. But if they are able to leave, then a lot of them will probably be wanting to return to their home countries in any event. If they're foreign students and so on. Those who aren't, I simply don't know what's going to happen to them. But they'd have a good claim under EU law to what's called subsidiary protection. At this stage in the conflict, it's actually quite difficult to say whether somebody has a case to be a refugee under the Refugee Convention. You have to show a well-founded fear of being persecuted for one of the convention reasons: your political opinion, your religion, your race, your nationality, membership of a particular social group. And when the Russians don't really control territory at the moment, or much territory, we don't know what they're doing in that territory. It's quite hard to say that you'd be persecuted for one of those reasons as such. You'd be caught as a civilian. You'd be in serious danger. Nobody's doubting that. And that's why subsidiary protection exists. It's kind of international human rights law, humanitarian law, and it offers protection to people who are caught in a conflict like that. And it means that they're entitled to asylum, although not necessarily to refugee status.
right. So it's just kind of short-term protection, getting people out of harm's way, and then we'll see.
Yeah, well, it's the sort of thing that the lawyers like me get quite excited about, the difference between this and refugee sort of status. But actually, it's essentially the same in European law.
Mm.
So the recognition is that yes, you need protection, and you can have it for the same period as a refugee, which is 5 years. So if those people do claim asylum, at this point, as I say, it's a bit difficult to say whether they are or aren't refugees as such, but they would be entitled, I'd have thought, to this subsidiary protection.
Mm. Do you think, given historical precedent, that we can trust Europe's generosity for the long run? When perhaps Ukraine has moved out of the headlines.
I don't know. And I suppose it depends how far back you go. So the analogy that comes to mind is the time that the Soviet tanks rolled into Hungary in 1956, and there was a huge effort to accommodate the refugees who fled. About 200,000 Hungarians fled at that time, and they were resettled. And it was clear from the start that once the tanks had rolled in, those people wouldn't be able to return, and it was therefore a permanent resettlement exercise. And countries stepped up and did their part. I think we all hope that, for the sake of Ukrainians, that they want to, that they a lot of them will want to go back, and that they will be able to go back at some point. But goodness knows when that's going to be at this point. It's just so early in the conflict, we just don't know.
Hmm. Finally, if people want to help, whether they're in the UK, in Europe, and is there anything that they can do, that they can contribute to?
So a few colleagues of mine have set up a project to try and help Ukrainians who might be eligible to come to the UK. It's a really fluid situation, so we're trying to keep track of what the legal requirements are at any given time. The website is advice-ukraine.co.uk, and if you head there, you can sign up to try and help. It's sort of details are being circulated on my own website, Free Movement, and also via ILPA. And if you send an email to ukrainevolunteers@freemovement.org.uk, then we'll get back to you and we'll let you know how you can help. But if people are wanting to give help more directly to Ukraine and to those caught in the conflict, then I point people to the Ukrainian embassy and their website, and they've got details there.
Great. Thank you so much for this concise and very helpful explanation. I really appreciate it. Are you hopeful at all that the position from the UK might change? I mean, they've been criticized quite a lot over the weekend.
I just don't know. I think when I heard some of the government statements, for example, from Boris Johnson, I thought that a change of position was imminent and that the UK would do more. That hasn't happened, and I'm starting to think it's not going to happen. I just don't know. There's an awful lot of public pressure on the government, but they so far seem to be very much sticking to their guns that visas won't be relaxed, and only a very narrow group of Ukrainians will be able to come here.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure talking. Thanks very much. Thank you.
That was Colin Yeo, immigration lawyer and founder of Free Movement. Now, I'm trying to get this podcast out as soon as possible this afternoon. Of course, the second that we hung up the call, there was some new developments announced. So Priti Patel is speaking in the House of Commons right now, talking about expanding the definition of family for the purpose of visa sponsorship so that parents and adult siblings will be able to come in as well. And a new visa scheme for British citizens and companies to sponsor Ukrainians seeking to come to the UK. Now, as Colin was reminding us, the devil's in the details. There is a wide gap between measures that are being announced by politicians and then their applications on the ground and into law. And that's often where we see things magically disappear as the news cycle moves on, as we've seen with the Afghan resettlement scheme. So time will tell, and unfortunately, there isn't all that much time for a lot of people. As Colin was also reminding us, you can support Ukrainian refugees by going through various organizations. You're all listening from so many countries that it's hard for me to point to any single one, but try going to the Ukrainian embassy in your own country for a list of where you might be able to help and donate. And don't forget that there are refugees from all sorts of places, and you can support them throughout the year and not just when the news compels us to, by going to organizations like the International Rescue Committee, for instance, or whatever works where you are. Thank you so much for listening and for paying attention. I know it's a weird time in news and it feels like history is just coming at us nonstop for pretty much the last 2 years. But if you're listening, like me, you are probably safe and sound somewhere, and I think we can be very grateful for that. Go to isabellehugal.com for essays, past episode, and to sign up for the newsletter so you don't miss anything. We'll be back next week on a regular schedule of new essays and or podcast episodes every Wednesday. I'm your host, Isabelle Hugal. Music was by Audionautics. Borderline is a One Lane Bridge production.